Welcome to Charm of the Wilderness, where we embark on a journey through the stunning landscapes of our national parks and public lands, expanding our understanding of climate justice and Indigenous justice along the way. I'm Elizabeth Dorr, your guide in exploring the rich tapestry of our national parks and public lands, discovering not only their breathtaking beauty, but also the vital lessons they hold for our planet's future, as well as the challenging history and current political context of these parks and public lands. Join me as I talk to inspiring, innovative, and driven people working in environmental justice, climate science, Indigenous education, equity in the outdoors, and more to delve into pressing environmental issues and learn how we can advocate for a more equitable and sustainable world for all. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Charm of the Wilderness. I'm really excited to have Betsy Gaines-Quammen with me as one of my first guests. Betsy is a historian and writer. She received a PhD from Montana State University, where she studied religion, history, and the philosophy of science. Her dissertation focused on Mormon history and the roots of armed public land conflicts occurring in the United States. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, New York Daily News, and the History News Network. She's the author of American Zion, Cliven Bundy, God and Public Lands in the West, and True West, Myth and Mending on the Far Side of America. Betsy lives in Montana with her husband, writer Dave Quammen. And I learned about Betsy because I got her book, American Zion, while I was doing some research about public lands in and around Utah, specifically related to the trip that we took to southern Utah to Zion and Bryce Canyon and Arches. And I was curious to kind of get a sense of the context and the history. And I became obsessed with everything that Betsy was talking about. I was so fascinated. And so what I'm going to do is put this over to Betsy. If you can maybe just start out and talk about a little bit about you, also the book American Zion. And then I am also curious about how you got interested in the topic, which is really about Mormon history as it intersects with public lands, public land policy even. Yeah, so I'm going to throw it over to you with that question.
Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much for having me. This is super fun. I love talking about this stuff, even though it's intense. I got to this issue through my absolute devotion to the American public land system. And, started out as a conservationist and worked for years and years with various nonprofit groups, working on everything from grizzly bear protection to bull trout protection to migratory corridors to wilderness protection. And so I really came to it because I knew that these armed sort of events not only were dangerous to public lands, but the roots of them were also very dangerous to the whole idea of public lands. So that's really where I came to it. And American Zion came out in 2020. It was my first book, and it was a version of my dissertation. So I looked at how cultures view landscapes. And I was looking at it how, in terms of preservationists, early conservationists in America had various ways of viewing landscapes. Again, I'm really interested in mythologies and the mythologies that our culture, our American culture, and I want to sort of put a disclaimer forth. American culture is not homogenous. There are a lot of different ways that people view landscape, from indigenous ways of seeing land to the preservationists like Emersonian ways of seeing public land, Roosevelt's way of seeing public land, and the Bundy's way of seeing public land, and everything in between. There's various ways. But I was really interested in looking at how a family in southern Nevada could convince themselves that not only was there no such thing as public land, that public land shouldn't be protected in the way that preservationists wanted it protected. And so I looked at kind of Thoreauvian and Emersonian ways of looking at land, which is land is perfect as untouched, untrammeled. And then I unpacked that and sort of I mean, it's not sort of, very much confronted that idea by saying this isn't untrammeled, unpeopled, pristine public land. It's indigenous homeland. And then I looked at the idea of LDS, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints point of view, which is land is in essence made pleasing to the eye of God through utilization, that it's an antithesis to these Emersonian ideas that land needs to be developed in order for it to in some ways become sacred. And so that really was the basis of my research, and looking at how those conflicting notions sort of are the layers to our public land systems, and really gets at some of the things that are being discussed today, like land back. This
Yeah.
is indigenous land. And so that's a layer of it. Then there's the Bundys who say the government shouldn't own land. They essentially either want it for the states or they want it personally. And then the conservationist sort of layer is land is best, sort of the way we regard land should be viewed as beautiful, as undeveloped, and as habitat. So that's kind of where I began my research. And then from there looked at where did these land use wars come from, and how were these various perspectives in conflict?
Yeah. Yeah, I found it so fascinating. And specifically, really so just to give folks a background, the book it takes you through the history of Mormonism and how they ended up in Utah, and also their relationships with indigenous peoples and the land there, and really tying that to present day events and people. And so I'd love for you to describe those events and people. So the Bundys specifically, as somebody from the West and really deeply rooted in the news from the West, I know who Cliven and Ammon and Ryan Bundy are, but I realized actually I was telling my writing group about your book, and a lot of them didn't know who the Bundys were. And I was like, oh, well, I have to go into this history, because at least in Oregon, especially because one of the occupations took place in Oregon, they are talked about a lot. Like there's a whole OPB series called Bundyville, which is really about kind of that public land and also the Bundys themselves. And so can you give us a little bit of background on who they are and what their, quote, movement is?
Sure. By the way, Leah Sotilli is one of my favorite humans ever, ever, ever. And she did Bundyville, and she is absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
I adore her.
So
And,
plug
and
for
I've gotten to
Bundyville.
Yes, plug for Bundyville. I've gotten to do events with her, and I think she is just the coolest person. So the Bundys. Well, the Bundys are a Mormon family that they're ranchers, and they had public land allotments. And so those of us in the West are really familiar not only with the takeover of Malheur Wildlife Refuge. I think it was
Which
really
is the 10th
shocking.
anniversary as we're speaking
I
right
know.
now.
I know. That's it's so crazy.
It
It's
feels
the
like it
10th
just
anniversary.
happened in my mind, but
Yeah. No, I mean I'll never forget being like, what is happening right now? I can't believe it. And I had visited the Bundys the year before the takeover of the refuge, because they'd been involved in an armed standoff in Nevada called the Battle of Bunkerville. And it essentially came from the fact that the Bundys had been illegally grazing on a public land allotment, which basically means federal lands that they were leasing for their cattle. And this allotment was no longer, it was illegal. The allotment lease had been canceled because the Bundys had been grazing illegally, because there was a species on the allotment called the desert tortoise that had been listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. This had been going on, illegal grazing, for 20 years. Not only were the Bundys notified that this was no longer an available allotment, they had been given an opportunity for compensation. So it was basically like your landlord contacting you and saying, I need you to move out, but I'm going to pay you to do it. The Bundys were the only ranching family that said no. There was one other guy, his last name was Nay, And he was fighting the government too, but during the battles fighting against the government with Cliven Bundy, who's the patriarch of this family, he passed away. So it was just Cliven who didn't take the buyout. All of his other neighbors did. He was the only one still grazing on public lands in the county. And so the government finally enforced, they finally sent law enforcement to carry out cattle removal. And what happened in 2014 is that the Bundys put out a statement on social media saying essentially the government is cattle rustling. And it attracted militia from all over the country who, as we were talking about before we started this podcast, were very much motivated by the events that had happened prior to this, which was Ruby Ridge with Randy Weaver and his family and law enforcement. And this was all around the idea that the government was overreaching and attacking Americans who had been unprovoked. Now, there's a lot to get into with that particular issue, and that's complicated, but they were motivated by that. They were also motivated by Waco. And this was after David Koresh had barricaded himself in the compound in Waco, and there'd been a fire, and lots of people had died, and a lot of people were blaming the government for murder. And so this became a cause célèbre, the issue of the day. And so militia came from all over the country to help Cliven Bundy protect his cattle against the overreach of the government. Meanwhile, he'd been illegally grazing his cows for 20 years. He owed all sorts of money in fines and in leasing fees. And yet he was able to present himself as somebody who was experiencing government overreach. And I will say the government, the BLM in this case, the Bureau of Land Management, didn't do a very good job with public outreach in and around this effort. They sent in black SUVs with tinted windows into a very rural, paranoid community with a long time culture of being suspicious of the government. I mean, if we think about the origins of the LDS Church, there were a number of conflicts that the early Mormon Church had with the government. Joseph Smith, the prophet, was murdered. And there'd been a number of mob incidences where Mormons who had been trying to create community and freedom of religion had been attacked not only by community members, but also by government positioning. And there was a great deal of, at the time, really, in the early Mormon Church, there were two issues that the public were really up in arms about, and it was polygamy and it was slavery. And the government decided that slavery was an issue that was they didn't want to deal with the abolitionists, and they really pivoted towards polygamy to whip up all this anger around that issue so that the Mormons would be the focal point rather than slave owners in the South.
So there's distraction from...
There was distraction from, a very, very central issue. But the Mormons had every reason to distrust the government. And I think that one of the reasons why I find history so important is that we, as Americans, sort of think like, it wasn't that long ago at all. I mean, there's a real reason why families like the Bundys and others are in the Great Basin, either it's Southern Nevada, it's Southern, all the way up into Idaho. That's where they went to escape government overreach. And those stories are as fresh as they were when it happened to their ancestors. So when the government came in to confiscate the cattle and the militia all came in to stand with the Bundys, there was a 2-hour armed standoff, and it shut traffic down on the interstate. That, the law enforcement was on one side, the Bundys and their supporters were on the other side, and the government ended up backing down because they didn't want another Waco. And
who wants to put their life on the line for cows?
Well, exactly. For ranchers who have a different version of the truth.
Yeah.
And so when the government backed down and the BLM and the police, I mean, there were a lot of law enforcement that came in from Las Vegas, which is the nearest sort of
Hub.
a city,
Yeah. Mhm.
municipality. They backed down. The Bundys really saw that as a victory, and it really empowered them. And a year after that happened, I went and interviewed the family. And a year after I interviewed the family in 2016, 10 years ago, the Bundy sons, Ryan and Ammon, with a much smaller group of militia, took over the Malheur Wildlife Refuge.
Yeah. For how long did they take it over? It was weeks that they
I
were
think it was
there.
5 weeks.
5 weeks. Yeah. It was wild because it was interesting because the reasons were somewhat similar, but it was a lot less organized. We would
Yeah,
say.
and a
Yeah.
lot less supported.
And a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, they didn't have the backing of like the Oath Keepers and some of the other folks that they've had. And you'll have to check me on that 5 weeks. That's just off the top of my
Yeah,
head.
I'll double
But
check.
I think it was about that.
Yeah, but it was definitely several weeks, and in the end, actually, was it 2 people were killed at kind of the end of the standoff?
Boy
Yeah,
Finicum was
Boy
killed.
Finicum. Yeah.
Yeah, they had peeled off. They weren't getting support from the town. It's such an interesting story. The town was divided, but most people wanted the Bundys out of there. They
Yeah.
did not like what was happening at the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, in part because there had been this collaborative project between ranchers, the Burns tribe, which are the northern Paiute, and environmentalists and Fish and Wildlife Service at Malheur Wildlife Refuge, where they did this collaborative effort to support the ranchers, support the tribe, support conservation, and then the government as a kind of facilitator. So people had really good relationships, or at least working relationships. So when the Bundys came in and said, we want the land to go back to the loggers, miners, and ranchers, people were like, what are you talking about? You know, this is a wildlife refuge. It's a place where cattle grazes. It's a place where the Burns tribe they have a very good relationship with the refuge. And so it doesn't even make sense to demand what you're demanding. So the reason why Lavoy Finicum and Ryan and others were headed towards John Day, they left the refuge, they were driving to John Day, was that there was a constitutional sheriff, which is another layer of this whole thing, who was going to support them. So they were seeking support in another town, but law enforcement set up blocks, and by then the FBI was very much involved. Roadblocks, they were stopped. Lavoy Finicum got in his car and kept going. And then he ran into a snowbank. He had a gun in his pocket, and he was shooting. He was saying, "Shoot me, shoot me, shoot me." I mean, it was kind of death by cop. I mean, that's what I've heard people say, that, and then he was pulling out his gun, and he was shot. And so when that happened, and there were arrests, the main organizers were arrested. Lavoy was dead. Weirdly and not surprisingly, then the cause had a murder, and that's when it got the attention that it got from the militia. Like, all of a sudden they had another Ruby Ridge, and so, it just, and I have to say it just stuns me that these folks who are so focused on government overreach are absolutely up in arms about Lavoy Finicum and Randy Weaver and Randy Weaver's wife. But when Renee Good gets shot in the face 3 times, all of a sudden the same people are saying, well, you've got to comply. Like, what is happening to the don't tread on me people? The don't tread on me people are the ones that are up in arms about government overreach. And we just saw the murder of a unarmed protester in Minneapolis, and the same people are like, no, you gotta obey the law. And it just stuns me.
I know.
that
There's
is
no
the same culture.
I know, and there's no convincing them otherwise. That
I know.
Yeah, it's wild. Just for context, we are recording on January 14th, so the Renee Good murder is pretty fresh. What's happening with the ICE crackdown in Minneapolis is really fresh. And I feel like like you said, there is a lot of overlap between that because I think that, there is this sense that among these folks that, and they wouldn't call it supporting government, but when the government is on their side, they're all about,
Exactly.
all about it. I mean, it's the same thing with like the abortion debate too. Let's not overregulate, except for uteruses. So, it's
No, I
like,
mean,
yeah,
and now we see that the people who are filling the ranks at ICE are the same folks that were in January 6th.
yeah,
So it just,
100%.
and
They were waiting for this
they're
moment.
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly. It just, I mean, it's the
I know.
irony, the
I know.
hypocrisy. It just is stunning.
And speaking of kind of now, I don't feel like it's a coincidence that it's a senator from Utah basically taking the lead on trying to sell off public lands to the highest bidder. So in the last several months, Senator Mike Lee has like made these multiple outrageous proposals for the budgets to require selling off millions of acres of public land to development and other entities. And he's still, he'll be back. He's kind of been thwarted at every stage, but he is also Mormon from Utah, but it feels like very connected to all of this too, that even though he's a senator, the history of his relationship with the land, in particular with public land, feels very much aligned with the focus of those first Mormons who settled in Utah. And so I'd love to hear about like kind of that, like even from like a policy standpoint, like how they've been kind of, that mindset has been able to infiltrate, politics as well.
Yeah, it is. I mean, on public lands, Mike Lee is a villain. And,
Yes.
he's one of the leaders that we really, really need to keep an eye out. And it just, and I should say that the Mormon Church, they don't support the actions of the Bundy family. So, when I always try to make that distinction because I have a lot of Mormon friends who are very committed to public lands and the environment, who care very much about it.
Yeah.
That said, it's really interesting to see the cultural difference between folks living in Salt Lake City and folks living in these rural communities that are dependent on or have been traditionally dependent on extraction. And so I do always want to make the distinction between rural and Salt Lake City Mormons, because the Mormon Church as a whole has different points of view on this. But I also want to say that in these rural communities, there is a real reason why there is anger, because these traditional industries that supported families with good paychecks, logging, grazing, and mining, which are dwindling and declining because of economic reasons. It's not, public lands advocates, because we keep going back and forth with, various shrinking the monument, national monument boundaries, increasing them, but it's really expensive now. We've taken all the low-hanging fruit in terms of extraction in these public lands, and they're terrible lands for grazing. I mean, it's marginal grazing in these southern Utah and southern Nevada lands. So but there is a reason why there's resentment there, because there have been so many arguments saying, well, just shift to the tourist industry. Well, we know tourism is seasonal, so and it doesn't pay very well. So, I've really tried to think about why there is this resistance, and it's something that you see in rural communities throughout the West. It's
Yeah.
not just LDS.
Regardless of, yeah.
That said, there is a very interesting cultural component to LDS residents throughout, this sort of area this Mormon corridor, which at one point was Deseret, which was the idea of Mormon empire that Brigham Young tried to enact, which it was a sixth of the United States that he wanted to have as Mormon homeland. This idea, Deseret, came from the notion of Mormon Zion. Mormon Zion came from a prophecy that Joseph Smith claimed he had heard from God, that there was a promised homeland for the Latter-day Saints. It was initially in Missouri. It was moved to Nauvoo, Illinois. And then when Joseph Smith was killed, his brother as well, that notion of Zion, Mormon Zion, got taken with the Mormon people led by Brigham Young over to the Great Basin, the Colorado Plateau, and, across these states, essentially from Oregon down to Mexico. So here we have this idea that this is God-given land. This notion of God-given land happens to be spread across a lot of public land. So there's a reason, religious reason, why there is a push to get this land back to either the states or to privatize it. I mean, we know that the Mormon Church is one of the biggest landowners in the United States right now. There's a reason why they're acquiring land.
I didn't realize that.
And yeah,
Wow.
Yep, they sure are. So in any case, Mike Lee has that religious layer. He also is part of this sort of right-wing push to have the government rid themselves of federal land, and there are a lot of people who want to buy federal land, and it's not going to be people like the Bundys who can afford it.
Mm-hmm.
So if we start getting rid of public land and it's going to the highest bidder, these ranchers that, have been fighting for rights are not going to be able to acquire the lands that they're fighting for. It's going to go to billionaires.
Yeah.
And so, Mike Lee he has been gunning for public lands, and he keeps sort of reinventing ways to do a gotcha. It's really interesting to see that the fight to protect public lands is incredibly bipartisan.
Very bipartisan. Yeah. I mean, that is honestly one of the only things that can be agreed upon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really, and I thank God. I mean, we love our public lands. This is one of the best things that Americans have is our public lands. And again, we talked about it a little bit early in the interview. These lands are native sacred lands. So it's in the book American Zion, I really talk about the fact that when I talked to Cliven Bundy and he was trying to explain to me why these lands belong to him and that he was legally entitled to them, that he created a beneficial use. His ancestors created a beneficial use. He said when the first Mormon pioneer, and he was talking about his own hypothetical ancestor, came out and that pioneer's horse drank out of the Virgin River, which is the Virgin River is the water source
and it
along
runs
his
through
ranch.
Zion National Park as well.
Yes. Yep. And so he said when that horse took the first drink, that hypothetical pioneer, Mormon ancestor, created a beneficial use. And at that moment, that land was his. Without recognizing the day before this hypothetical Mormon ancestor's horse drank out of the river, it was Southern Paiute land. And so these ways of seeing, I found it as a researcher, it's really important that we understand how people perceive lands and the myths that they tell themselves. I mean, the myth of manifest destiny, the myth of free land, the myth that that the cowboy lifestyle is somehow heroic.
Mhm.
You know, these ranchers on public lands are heavily subsidized.
Oh, yeah.
And so you can have a cow calf pair on public lands, which is, you know, a mom and a baby, and you pay a buck, I think like a buck 25 per cow calf pair, which is an animal unit monthly. That's how it's termed, AU, buck 25. And if you graze that same cow calf pair on private land, in my, you know, when I've talked to ranchers around Montana, it's up towards $30 to $35 a mom and a calf. And so, you know, it's astonishing
Yeah,
how subsidized this is.
actually ProPublica and High Country News just released a report that they did on an investigation on public land subsidies or subsidies for grazing on public land, and there's like a 93% discount essentially for grazing, like compared to market value. And kind of going back to like the people like the Bundys are not going to benefit from any of this, because I mean they're going to benefit in some ways. What is it, BLM land, that it was like 2/3 of the livestock grazing on BLM land belong to 10% of ranchers. And so it's like these wealthy
Exactly, it's rich people.
ranchers, it's the rich
Yeah.
people who are benefiting, and then they're also making it harder for these other ranchers to have good land to graze upon, because we're overgrazing because of this. And so yeah, it's wild. But it also, this like concept that the Bundys have is very much that kind of frontier Western myth, as you said, that went along with like just colonial settlement, you know,
Yeah.
the history of that, because it's just so very American to be like, well, I was the first one that utilized it in my definition of use. Because and kind of going back to what you were saying earlier in your introduction about how we are also fed this myth that before settlers came to the West or came to the United States, that this land was completely untouched, which is
Yeah.
a really harmful narrative. It seems benign, but it's harmful because indigenous peoples were here for millennia stewarding and managing the land, but they were
Yep.
doing it in a way that didn't look like it, because it was thriving because
Yeah.
ecosystems were thriving, and so it didn't
Yep.
seem like management was happening. And so that's the definitions that we're going between. The concept of whose land we're on is extremely contentious, because anywhere in North America, the land that you're on is native land. And
It's native land.
Yeah. And no matter how much anyone wants to deny it, but politically speaking, Native peoples don't have the right to the land in the same way that the descendants of white settlers do. And so it's yeah.
And conservationists fell into that same narrative. I mean, you know,
100%.
or I should say, not fell into it. I created it. You know, celebrated. You know, the unpeopled landscape. I mean, I have a friend here in Bozeman, Shane Doyle, who's Crow, who is looking at Yellowstone National Park and really bringing forth all the uses that the Crow people, you know, sort of, I mean, how they utilize the land, how they lived on the land. And, you know, this includes the Blackfeet and the Sioux and the Shoshone.
Mhm.
You know, these were not unpeopled lands. And so the conservationists, you know, with the wilderness bill talking about untrammeled land, there was no untrammeled land in America.
Mhm. Oh, this is one thing, kind of taking it to the national parks. To me, I found it really interesting, especially because I was reading your book at the same time that I was in southern Utah and in Zion, Bryce, in Capitol Reef, etc. And there was a lot of literature and National Park Service literature that talked about Mormon settlers. And it was, you know, in a very kind of neutral way. There is like this acknowledgement of the history there. There is acknowledgement, at least as far as when I was there, I don't know if things have changed, of indigenous history and the land of the peoples who are original to the lands there as well. But I do remember you writing about there were a lot of Mormon settlers involved in the establishment of Zion National Park. And so I'm curious to hear what you know about kind of that connection of the national parks, and not necessarily national parks, but like the good relationships between public land, government public land, and the Mormon settlers that are there or were, in the beginning of the establishment of these parks.
Yeah, there was Zion was a really great example of the, very genial collaboration between the government and the local people there. The local people were really enthusiastic. They liked the idea of tourism coming. My dissertation has way more about this sort of culture of collaboration, but there were all sorts of ideas that local people had to set up opportunities for, inns and restaurants and, just cool things that would be ways to make additional money, because these folks were not making a great deal of money. I mean, this was not an easy land to live on. And so a lot of really solid relationships, a lot of goodwill. And then the Park Service started looking for more places to create parks. And it's one of the things that I write about is in 1936, there was a meeting to discuss making Escalante a national park. And that's when you start to see this goodwill sour.
Mm-hmm.
And so this was after the passage of what became the Taylor Grazing Act. So the government was starting to regulate what was happening on public lands. And there was a big concern among the local people that with national parks, they would no longer be able to graze. And Escalante, people know, if you know Escalante, you know that it's been an enormously controversial
Yeah, I mean, it continues to be. I mean, it's the biggest target on Trump, at least Trump slashed like half of it in his first administration.
Yep. And so in 1996, Clinton designated it as a national monument. Trump got into office. He slashed the borders, the boundaries. So it's been a political football. But this started in 1936, and the ranchers down there are starting to feel very pressured. And it's funny to read the minutes because things are still polite, but there's an edge that you can really see in the transcripts of the meetings discussing the national park. So this was 1936, and it wasn't until 1996 that it got established as a national monument. By then, you have any number of laws that are regulating the use of federal land. You have the Endangered Species Act, you have FLIPMA, you have NEPA. There's been wilderness inventories in these areas. These folks who have been utilizing public lands for generations, which they feel gives them propriety, are feeling government overreach because the government is trying to manage this land in an environmentally, sort of sensitive way, and are interested in taking care of species, and grazing. Grazing impacts ecosystems. It impacts watersheds. It brings in invasive species. I struggle with the idea of grazing on public lands, especially when most of it's done by rich people, which, come on. But in Montana, these big ranches owned by rich people who have public land leases are staying intact through conservation easements because of these operations, and providing corridors for migratory animals. So there are ranchers in certain areas that really are important for keeping open space, for keeping migratory corridors open, even if they have a sweetheart deal with the government. But in some of these places around the Mojave Desert, I mean, I wouldn't let a cow graze there because it's kind of mean.
Yeah. No, I mean, they're not the most hospitable places to have anybody live. That is not adapted to desert living.
Yeah. So, that's where the Bundys are, right by the Mojave. And I mean, it is, these cows, I have no idea what they're eating. Now, I've talked to Mormon ranchers who are very proud of the fact that they can fatten cattle on this land, and they some of them but it's not great for the land, and it is heavily subsidized, and there are only a few people who are really it. In any case, it's when this started happening that the over, what local saw as overregulation, that really spurred the Sagebrush Rebellion of, the 70s, really sort of tied into states' rights. That's when the states, Nevada and Utah, first and foremost, but other states as well, really started wanting public lands to be in states' hands. The issue is that states cannot afford to manage public lands, and states would sell it, and it would be a disaster. And yet that's something that Mike Lee keeps wanting to do.
He wants it so badly. He wants everything to be like a fancy hotel, is what it's.
It's so gross.
It's so gross. But you end your book talking about Grand Staircase Escalante and the town of Boulder, Utah, as an example. I think this is everywhere, every rural area. There's this, for people who live there for generations, there's this existential tie for them to mining, to logging. That's, rural Oregon is very much, it's the logging communities, it's ranching and grazing, it's extraction. Yet it doesn't actually financially benefit the majority of people in these communities. It benefits a few and mostly rich people. And so it really is like this, there's this need for a paradigm shift to get people to understand that, like, when you're setting up a business around an environmentally protected area, a recreational area, it's better for the local economy in the long run, and it's not going to go away. Like, when the trees are all gone or the uranium is all gone, those industries are leaving. And so, but that likely won't happen if you're going to be protecting these areas. But there is a real disconnect between the reality and this myth that that's where economies are centered on, is extraction.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a couple of points. The boom bust cycle is inevitable. I mean, that's going to happen in a resource-rich area that gets extracted unsustainably. I will say that I think conservationists have done a bad job of working with communities to we needed to go in and create sustainable economic opportunities. If we were going to, because you're right, a place next to a protected landscape, a public lands, communities next to public lands do prosper. They prosper. I mean, that economic data is there. They are more vibrant. But what environmentalists have said, and myself included, I have been guilty of this. I moved to Colorado when I was 18, and I was all about conservation. I moved to Montana when I was 23. I wanted to protect the environment, and these little communities that were dependent on traditional extraction practices, I'm like, just pivot, do something else. And that wasn't a good way to address it, and it caused a lot of resentment, and it slowed down the process. I mean, I truly think that had there been more compassion and understanding on the part of conservation interests to work with communities in transition, and not to pit jobs versus the environment. That is not true. Jobs versus the environment was made up by people who wanted conservationists not to have power, but it was a really easy slogan for rural people to adopt. And I think a great sort of a great amount of culpability should be on the part of environmentalists who just didn't think it through. And so I'm seeing that change quite a bit. I'm seeing conservationists admit that saying an unpeopled landscape is destructive. It's erasing history. I'm seeing conservationists say, no, we do need to take care of rural communities. I mean, one of the reasons why we're in the political sort of polarization moment that we're in is because rural communities weren't considered. Now, there's a
Mhm.
lot more to that, and I could get
Mhm.
into it. I mean, I study extremism in rural communities, and I study white supremacy, and I mean, I there's so many layers to that I also understand people saying don't say that rural communities, or white communities aren't getting enough attention. I'm going to say I understand that argument.
Mhm.
However, I also think there were communities that were disenfranchised that didn't have to be if their economic opportunities, their bread and butter had been considered.
Yeah. Well, and I think that kind of going back to the Malheur Refuge, I think the partnerships that you talked about that like made the relationship so good in that region are because there was collaboration and communication among and between landowners, indigenous tribes, and the conservation organizations. I've seen a couple of examples for projects like that, similar projects, but more about tree focused projects in Eastern Oregon, where landowners and conservationists and tribes have come together really well because they have similar interests, but they have to like talk about it. And so it's a good example that people can come together. And I Katherine Hayhoe, I'm looking up at my bookshelf, but Katherine Hayhoe wrote a book called Saving Us, mostly about climate communication. And I loved her approach because I think it's so applicable across topics. Where it really is like find the values that you share and go with that. And then, that's where you can start. And I think that it's very tricky. I mean, and that goes for any kind of political discussion. It goes for, talking about racial justice. It talks about climate change. It talks about public lands and jobs and all of that. And, we all have something that we care about and people that we care about. And so let's start there. And you can build relationships that way.
I agree. I mean,
Mhm.
I think, my second book is about tackling toxic mythologies.
Mhm.
And I really do go out into rural communities and find people who are angry. And I try to engage with them on topics that are possible to find agreement. Again, there are bad guys. I also, in this second book, True West, trace the Bundy standoff in Nevada to the January 6th insurrection. So I'm very aware that there are people that we're not going to find common ground with. That are,
yeah.
and that said,
Yeah.
I do think that there are opportunities for conversation, and that's what my second book really does. It takes kind of the events that happened in Malheur and in Bunkerville, and then looks at the myths around those events, and then kind of look at how Western myths have gotten us to where we are in the West today, and what we can do to myth bust and be in conversation.
I love that. I just ordered the book, so I'm excited to read it.
Oh, good. I'm not trying to sell it to you. I'm just
No, you should. No, you're
please
selling
do.
it. No, so I also write about like disaster preparedness in relation to climate change, and there's this whole swath of preppers, right-wing, rich preppers who have this. No, they're not all rich, actually. I'd say all kind of right-wing preppers kind of have that is that very American myth, this like frontiersman myth, building bunkers because like and it's like they want the apocalypse to happen so that they can live out this like fantasy, this Wild West fantasy. And it's
and
wild.
It's also second coming. It's a religious
Oh,
fantasy too.
100%, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm excited to read it.
Oh,
And
good. Well,
Well, I loved American Zion, and I'm like, oh, well, I'm going to read all of your books.
Thank you.
Do you have another book coming out? You said you have a. Yeah, let's
I
talk about
do.
that. What is the book and what it is about?
Okay, it's a little bit of, I always am kind of interested in the same theme. So it's a little bit of what I've written about before, but it's a ghost story book. It's a cultural and sociological, cultural and historical backgrounds on ghost stories. And it looks at America as a haunted land. And I talk about ghost stories with the Underground Railroad. I talk about ghost stories with various extinct species. I look at ghost stories in red light districts and mining towns. I happen to believe in ghosts. So I'm a historian and an
Too.
academic, and I totally believe in ghosts. So I have ghost stories in there but I also talk about it metaphorically. Like,
Mhm.
if we live in a haunted land, we better listen to our ghosts. Like, how can we unhaunt our land?
Oh my
And
gosh, yeah.
and
How can we
so
please
that's
the
how
ghosts that you
exactly, like, listen to them,
Yeah.
instead of trying to erase their history, listen to them. So I have, I have a story in Florida about the first European fort built American soil by the Spanish. It's a very haunted place in St. Augustine. St. Augustine is the longest continually settled European community in the continent.
Wow.
And so I talk about colonialism haunting and conquest haunting and slavery haunting. I talk about Indian boarding schools haunting and in assimilation. And I talk about dams and land and water manipulation and ghost stories around those. And it's been such the number one, it's more of, I shouldn't say lighthearted. It's not. It's America is a haunted land, but it's got ghost stories that I hope are kind of page turners because
Yeah.
everybody loves ghost
I
stories.
I love a ghost story. Go back to my camp days, and
I
they're all
know.
ghost stories that you thrill the kids with.
I mean, at a time when we have an administration that is literally trying to erase history that they don't like or they think affronts them, when I talk about that, I mean, one of this fort in St. Augustine has had this executive order impact them. They're now reviewing all the signs because this fort was the place that Pratt, who invented the Carlisle boarding school model, he invented it at this fort. So this fort not only was a
Oh,
Spanish
wow.
fort to defend against the French and pirates and the British, and dating back to the late 1500s, it's had all these things happen through the years, and it became a prison where a number of Plains tribes members were unjustly imprisoned, and that Pratt created the Carlisle boarding school model for assimilation. And again, I'm talking about this land with its haunted history is full of ghosts, and we need to listen to those ghosts in order to have a better future.
I cannot wait to read it. What is it called, and when is it coming out?
It's coming out September 1st, and it's
Okay.
called This Haunted Land.
Okay.
And we're still trying to figure out the subtitle. So
So it's
the
not
cover.
available
We're designing the
for
cover.
pre-order yet, but
It's not quite
Yeah.
available, but I think it'll be available maybe at the beginning of March.
oh,
and then
great.
It comes out in
So who knows?
September.
Maybe
Yeah.
by the time this goes live,
Yes.
it will be available for pre-order. Well, that sounds incredible. And where else can people find you?
Oh my gosh, I'm so easy to find. I mean, I have a website. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky. I have a secret account on Twitter just because I'm a glutton for punishment, but I don't really advertise that. But I do have to look at how garbagey everything's becoming.
You got to see
Twitter
what
is
the other
garbage site.
side. Yeah.
Yeah. X
Yeah.
is really
Yeah.
But yeah, I do peek in on that. But yeah, I'm easy to find, and you can find me at independent bookstores. People carry my book. I mean, I hate to recommend it. You can find me on Amazon. I
Yeah,
like
but
independent bookstores
go
better.
bookshop or just go to your local bookstore.
Yeah, go to Pals. If you're
Yeah.
in Portland, go to Pals.
Yeah.
It's right there on the bookshelf. So, or in Bozeman, go to Country Bookshelf. There's so many awesome places.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, it was such a pleasure talking with you, Betsy, and I can't wait to
Thank
connect
you.
more.
It's such a fun talking to you. I can't wait to hear about your, projects and your book and this podcast. And consider me somebody who's going to be a fan.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Charm of the Wilderness. I hope you felt inspired to appreciate the richness of our public lands and national parks and the vital role they play in the climate justice movement. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your friends. You can also receive these episodes right in your inbox by subscribing to Charm of the Wilderness on Substack. Together, we can raise awareness and foster a deeper connection with nature and each other. Until next time, keep exploring the wild charm around you, and remember, every little action counts in the fight for our planet. Stay curious and connected.